Imagine getting fined $500 because your grass was half an inch too tall. Now imagine that fine wasn't about the grass at all. The day started like any other in West Haven, the kind of suburban neighborhood where every house looked like it had been cloned in a factory. The lawns were trimmed to perfection. The mailboxes stood at uniform angles, and the air reeked of fresh mulch and judgment. Mark Harper, a 46-year-old black man and retired Army veteran, had spent the morning like he always did, sipping coffee on his front porch, watching the world wake up. Mark wasn't your average suburban dad. Sure, he mowed his lawn every Saturday, waved at the neighbors, and pretended not to hear their passive-aggressive remarks. But under his calm, composed demeanor was a man who had seen things most people couldn't even imagine. Years in the military had hardened him, but it also gave him a sense of justice he couldn't ignore. His house was his sanctuary, his pride. Every inch of that lawn, every flower in the garden, every coat of paint on the shutters was his work. After losing his wife Jenny to cancer 3 years ago, he'd poured his grief into making his home a place of beauty and peace. His 22-year-old son Travis, a college student with a passion for social justice, called it Dad's Therapy Project. This particular morning, as Mark sat with his mug of strong black coffee known of that pumpkin spice nonsense, noticed a crisp white envelope sticking out of his mailbox. It had the unmistakable stamp of West Haven HOA, Homeowners Association. But let's be honest, they're TSJ in spirit. He groaned audibly. "Here we go," he muttered, walking over to retrieve it. The HOA had a reputation for nitpicking the hell out of everything. Last month, someone had been fined for leaving their garden hose coiled the wrong way. Mark tore open the envelope with a flick of his thumb and began reading. Notice of violation. Dear Mr. Harper, it has come to our attention that your lawn exceeds the allowed height of 3 inches. You are hereby fined $500 for non-compliance with community standards. Payment is due within 14 days to avoid further penalties. Best regards, West Haven HOA. Mark stood there, staring at the paper as if it had just insulted his entire bloodline. "What the fuck is this?" he barked into the empty air. His lawn was immaculate pristine even. He mowed it religiously every week. If there was a competition for suburban landscaping, his yard would be on the damn brochure. He stormed back to the porch, muttering under his breath. His neighbor, Betty Clark, waved at him from across the street. Her lawn, which looked like a scene from Jurassic Park, was clearly untouched by a mower for weeks. Mark waved back, though it felt more like an obligatory salute to enemy forces. "Morning, Mark," Betty called, her voice sugary sweet. "Everything okay?" Mark forced a smile. "Just peachy, Betty. How's the jungle coming along?" She blinked, clearly not catching the sarcasm. "Oh, it's all about the natural look these days." Mark gritted his teeth. "Sure, natural. Like letting nature take over your damn property." He went back inside, where his phone buzzed on the counter. It was a message from Travis. Travis. "Hey, Dad, how's life in Stepford?" Mark. "Same old. Hose on my ass again." Travis. "What now? Too much melanin for the neighborhood?" Mark. "Apparently my grass is too tall." Travis. "Dude, what the hell? Are they serious?" Mark sighed and tossed the phone down. "Serious?" Oh, they were dead serious. He knew exactly what this was. It wasn't about the grass, it was about control. The HOA, led by Jim Rayner, a smug white guy with a permanent tan from all his golf trips, had been gunning for him ever since he moved in. Jim was the kind of guy who called himself a community leader, but really just liked bossing people around. At every HOA meeting, Jim's condescending smile and thinly veiled jabs made it clear he didn't think Mark belonged in West Haven. Mark didn't have time for this nonsense. He grabbed his old lawnmower relic from his military days and pushed it across the yard, fuming. The sound of the engine roared to life, drowning out his frustration. He mowed the grass until it was shorter than Jim Rayner's patience. When he finished, he stood back, admiring his work. The lawn was flawless, the edges razor sharp. If they wanted perfection, they damn well had it now. But something told him this wasn't the end of it. As he packed up the mower, he noticed a car creeping down the street. It was a black SUV with tinted windows, standard HOA patrol vehicle. The window rolled down, and there was Jim, grinning like a Cheshire cat. "Morning, Mark," Jim called out. "Just checking in. Looks like you are finally getting the hang of the rules." Mark wiped his brow and stared him down. "Oh, I've got the rules memorized. Maybe you should check your own yard next time." Jim chuckled, a low, smug laugh that made Mark's skin crawl. We all have to do our part, right? Have a great day. Mark stood there, fists clenched, watching as the SUV rolled away. Inside, he felt a storm brewing. This wasn't just about grass, it was about respect. And Mark wasn't about to let these people walk all over him. As he headed back inside, his phone buzzed again. It was another message from Travis. Travis, you gonna let them get away with this? Mark, not a chance. Mark didn't know how yet, but he was going to fight back. And when he did, Jim Raynor and his little HOA cronies were going to wish they'd left him and his damn lawn alone. Mark spent the rest of the day simmering like a pot left too long on the stove. The whole grass too tall excuse wasn't just ridiculous, it was insulting. For years, he'd kept his yard in pristine condition, and now these HOA clowns were trying to paint him as the neighborhood slob? Hell no. By the next morning, Mark was ready to go straight to the source, the West Haven HOA. Their office was just a few blocks away, tucked in one of those overly sterile strip malls that smelled like desperation and cinnamon from the nearby pretzel stand. The place reeked of bureaucracy. Mark walked in, his boots clicking on the polished floor. The receptionist, Linda, looked up from her desk with a fake smile plastered across her face. "Good morning, sir," she chirped. Her voice was as sweet as syrup, but Mark could see the judgment in her eyes. "How can I assist you today?" Mark slapped the letter down on the counter, the edges slightly crumpled from his earlier fit of rage. "Yeah, Linda, I'd like to know why I am being fined for having grass that's what half an inch too tall, because unless T here is some new kind of HOA-approved ruler, my lawn's perfectly fine." Linda's smile didn't falter, but her tone sharpened like a knife. "We've received multiple complaints about your property, Mr. Harper. It's our responsibility to ensure the neighborhood maintains its standards." Mark arched an eyebrow. "Standards? Is that what you call it? Funny, because I see plenty of yards that look like the aftermath of a tornado, but I don't see them getting fined." She blinked, clearly unprepared for his directness. "I am not at liberty to discuss other residents' violations." "Of course, you are not," Mark muttered, leaning on the counter. "But let me guess, Jim Raynor's the one who filed the complaint, isn't he?" Linda hesitated, just for a second, and that was all the confirmation Mark needed. "I thought so," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Well, you can tell Jim he's going to need more than a ruler and a bad attitude to push me around." Linda opened her mouth to respond, but Mark was already turning on his heel, heading for the door. Behind him, he heard her mutter something under her breath, but he didn't care. He was done playing their game. Back at home, Mark stood on his front porch, staring out at the neighborhood like a soldier surveying the battlefield. His eyes landed on Jim's house, practically a shrine to suburban mediocrity. The guy even had one of those ridiculous live, laugh, love signs hanging in his front window. Mark's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Travis. "Travis, any updates?" Mark went to the HOA office. "Same bullshit." Travis, "You really think they're just picking on you because of grass?" Mark, "Number, it's personal." And it was. Mark didn't have concrete proof yet, but he knew the signs. He'd seen it before in the military, in the workforce, even in casual encounters at the grocery store. It wasn't always overt, but it was always there. The double standards, the microaggressions, the unspoken message that he didn't belong. Later that evening, Mark decided to do a little reconnaissance of his own. He grabbed a flashlight and headed out under the cover of darkness. If Jim wanted to play games, Mark was more than ready. The first stop was Betty Clark's yard across the street. Her lawn was a jungle, complete with weeds tall enough to hide a small dog. Mark crouched down and used the flashlight to measure the grass height. 6 inches minimum, he muttered. But sure, I am the problem. Next, he wandered down to Steve and Carol's place. Their backyard looked like a construction site, with piles of dirt and an abandoned wheelbarrow. No fine there either, he was sure. As he made his way back to his own property, a sudden noise caught his attention. It was faint, but unmistakable. The sound of a camera shutter. Mark froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned slowly, scanning the darkness, but saw nothing. "All right, Jim," he muttered under his breath. "If that's you, you'd better start running." The next morning, Mark woke up to find another letter in his mailbox. This time, it wasn't just a fine, it was a warning. Notice of non-compliance. Dear Mr. Harper, further violations of HOA standards may result in additional fines or legal action. We urge you to take immediate steps to address the ongoing issues with your property. Best regards, West Haven HOA. Mark crumpled the paper in his fist. They were escalating, and he knew exactly why. This wasn't about grass, it was about power. Jim and his cronies didn't like the fact that Mark wasn't falling in line, and now they were trying to make an example out of him. "Well," Mark muttered, tossing the letter onto the kitchen counter, "two can play that game." He grabbed his phone and dialed Travis. "Hey, Dad," Travis answered, his voice groggy from sleep. "Travis, I need your help. These HOA assholes are digging their claws in, and I need to dig back." "What do you need?" Travis asked, fully awake now. "Everything you can find on Jim Raynor and his buddies. Finances, complaints, scandals, anything that proves they're not as squeaky clean as they pretend to be." Travis chuckled. "You know this is kind of my thing, right? I'll start digging." "Thanks, son," Mark said. "And hurry. I have a feeling things are about to get worse." Mark hung up and sat back in his chair, staring out the window. The neighborhood looked so peaceful, so idyllic. But he knew better. Beneath the surface, it was a powder keg waiting to explode. And Mark was more than ready to light the fuse. Mark had always believed in the saying, "If you want something done right, you do it yourself." But even he had to admit that sometimes a little help didn't hurt. That's why he called Travis. His son was like a modern-day Sherlock Holmes with a smartphone if there was dirt to be found. Travis would unearth it and package it up in a neat little folder. 2 days after their phone call, Travis sent over an email with the subject line, "You are gonna love this." The attachment was a goldmine. Mark opened it and started reading, his coffee going cold as the pieces began to fall into place. Subject 1. James. Jim Raynor. Multiple complaints from residents about selective enforcement of HOA rules. Allegations of embezzling HOA funds, unconfirmed but suspicious bank transfers noted. A lawsuit in 2015 for misappropriation of funds that was quietly settled out of court. Mark's lips curled into a grin. "Jim, you sneaky little bastard." The best part? Jim wasn't just petty, he was sloppy. The paper trail Travis had uncovered was as messy as a teenager's bedroom. That afternoon, Mark decided it was time to get proactive. He wasn't going to wait for Jim to come knocking again. He was taking the fight straight to his front door. Armed with a stack of printouts from Travis's research, Mark marched across the street to Jim's house. The air was thick with the scent of freshly cut grass, probably from one of the neighborhood's other model citizens. Mark couldn't help but roll his eyes at the irony. Jim answered the door with his usual smirk. "Mark," he said, leaning casually against the doorframe. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Mark held up the papers. "You've got some explaining to do, Jim. Care to tell me why the HOA's treasurer keeps making personal withdrawals from the community fund?" Jim's smirk faltered for a split second before he recovered. "I have no idea what you are talking about." "Oh, come on," Mark said, stepping closer. "Don't play dumb. You are good at a lot of things, Jim, but covering your tracks isn't one of them." Jim's eyes narrowed. "Are you accusing me of something, Mark? Because that's a dangerous game you are playing." Mark chuckled darkly. "Dangerous? That's rich coming from the guy who thinks he owns this neighborhood. Here is the thing, Jim. I am not afraid of you. I've faced way bigger threats than a middle-aged man with a superiority complex." Jim straightened up, his smirk replaced with a scowl. "You'd better watch yourself, Harper. I have connections." "Connections?" Mark barked out a laugh. "What are you going to do, Jim? Send the neighborhood watch after me? Maybe find me for breathing too loud?" Jim didn't answer. He just slammed the door, but not before Mark caught the flicker of panic in his eyes. That was the moment Mark knew he'd struck a nerve. That evening, Mark decided to take things a step further. He called up a few of his neighbors' people who had also been on the receiving end of Jim's ridiculous fines and arbitrary rules. "Hey, Tom," Mark said, dialing his next-door neighbor. "Got a minute?" Tom's voice crackled through the line. "What's up, Mark? Something wrong?" "Let's just say I've got some dirt on Jim, and I think you'll want to hear it." "Jim? The HOA guy?" Tom let out a bitter laugh. "What's he done this time?" Mark grinned. "Oh, nothing much. Just stealing from the community fund and pretending he's the king of West Haven. You busy tonight? I am thinking of organizing a little meeting." "I am in," Tom said immediately. "That guy's been a pain in my ass for years." By 7 p.m., a small group had gathered in Mark's living room. There was Tom, who'd been fined for leaving his Christmas lights up too long. Linda, who'd gotten a warning about her non-compliant mailbox. And even Betty Clark, whose wild lawn suddenly didn't seem like such a big deal. Mark laid out everything Travis had dug up, passing around the printouts like a teacher handing out a pop quiz. The room buzzed with murmurs of disbelief and anger. "This is insane," Betty said, shaking her head. I always knew Jim was shady, but this is next level. So, what's the plan? Tom asked, his voice tinged with both curiosity and determination. You are not just going to sit on this, are you? Mark leaned back in his chair, a wicked grin spreading across his face. Oh, we're doing more than sitting. Tomorrow, we're taking this to the HOA meeting. Let's see how Jim likes being put on the spot. The next morning, Mark woke up to find a letter taped to his door. The envelope was unmarked, but the message inside was clear. Drop it, Harper. Or else. Mark stared at the note, his jaw tightening. If Jim thought a cheap intimidation tactic was going to scare him off, he clearly didn't know who he was dealing with. Mark wasn't just some pushover homeowner. He was a man who had survived wars, loss, and the kind of adversity Jim couldn't even begin to comprehend. Mark folded the note and slipped it into his pocket. He had a meeting to prepare for, and he wasn't about to back down now. The day of the HOA meeting had arrived, and Mark Harper was ready to bring the house down. The community center was packed more people than Mark had ever seen at one of the mundane gatherings. The air buzzed with tension, the kind that makes you feel like you are walking into a courtroom rather than a suburban meeting about lawn heights and mailbox placement. Mark strolled in, his stride calm but deliberate. In his hand was a thick folder filled with the evidence Travis had compiled, and his expression said, "Try me." He scanned the room and locked eyes with Jim Raynor, seated at the front like some self-appointed king of West Haven. Jim's smirk was gone, replaced with a tight-lipped frown. Good. That meant he was worried. The meeting kicked off with the usual nonsense. Announcements about trash pickup schedules and reminders about community values. Jim stood at the podium, his voice oozing false charm. As always, he said, we're here to maintain the high standards that make West Haven such a wonderful place to live. Mark leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, and muttered just loud enough for his neighbors to hear, "High standards, my ass." A few people around him chuckled nervously. The tension was palpable. Finally, the floor opened for community concerns. Mark shot out of his chair before anyone else could speak. He walked up to the microphone with the kind of confidence that could silence a crowd, and boy, did it work. All eyes were on him. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice steady but with an edge. "For those of you who don't know me, I am Mark Harper. You might recognize me as the guy whose lawn apparently caused a neighborhood-wide crisis." There were a few chuckles from the crowd. Mark let the humor settle before dropping the bomb. "But tonight, we're not here to talk about my grass. No, tonight we're here to talk about Jim Raynor." The room fell dead silent. Jim's face flushed red, and he squirmed in his seat like a kid caught with his hand in the cookie jar. "Over the past few weeks," Mark continued, pulling out the folder, "I've been looking into some interesting financial activity within the HOA. Specifically, funds that seem to disappear faster than a plate of cookies at a bake sale." A ripple of whispers swept through the room. Mark held up a page of highlighted transactions. For example, this transfer right here. $10,000 from the HOA account to a private account linked to Wait for It Jim Raynor. Jim shot up from his seat. "This is outrageous," he barked, his voice cracking. "You have no right to." "Oh, sit down, Jim," Mark snapped, cutting him off. "You've been running this OA like your personal piggy bank, and everyone here deserves to know about it." The crowd erupted. People who had been quietly stewing over their own grievances with Jim were now shouting questions and demands. Jim looked like he was about to spontaneously combust. "I've got more," Mark said, holding up another page. "Remember that lawsuit from 2015, Jim? The one you settled out of court? Yeah, turns out that wasn't a one-time thing. You've been pulling this crap for years." At this point, the room was in chaos. Some people were yelling at Jim. Others were cheering for Mark. Jim, desperate to regain control, tried to shout over the noise. "This is a personal attack," he screamed, his face now the color of a ripe tomato. "You are trying to ruin my reputation." Mark stepped closer to the podium, his voice cold and steady. "You ruined your own reputation, Jim. All I am doing is holding up a mirror." Jim was about to fire back when the doors to the community center burst open. Two uniformed police officers strode in, their presence sucking the air out of the room. "James Raynor?" one of them called out. Jim froze. What's this about?" The officer held up a warrant. "You are under arrest for embezzlement and fraud." The room exploded again, but this time it was a mixture of gasps and cheers. Jim stammered and tried to plead his case, but the officers weren't having it. They cuffed him right there in front of everyone and let him out, his protests fading into the night. Mark watched it all unfold with a grim sense of satisfaction. He turned back to the crowd, which was now buzzing with excitement and disbelief. "Let this be a lesson," he said, his voice carrying over the noise. "You can't bully people, lie to them, and steal from them without consequences. Not on my watch." The room erupted in applause. Neighbors who had barely spoken to Mark before were now patting him on the back, thanking him for standing up to Jim. Later that night, as Mark sat on his porch with a well-earned beer in hand, Travis called. "You did it, Dad," Travis said, his voice filled with pride. "You took that guy down." Mark chuckled. "Damn right I did, but I couldn't have done it without you, son." "Well, now the whole neighborhood knows not to mess with the Harpers." Mark took a sip of his beer, the cool liquid washing away weeks of frustration. "Let them try," he said with a smirk. "I dare them." For the first time in weeks, the air in West Haven felt lighter. The fight was over, and Mark had won not just for himself, but for every person who'd ever been steamrolled by someone like Jim Raynor. And as he sat there, listening to the quiet hum of the night, he realized one thing. His lawn wasn't just a patch of grass. It was a statement.